The biggest mistake Lily Hartley ever made was letting her goat read other people's mail. The second biggest mistake was giving a bath to a wolf the size of a parlor door. The kingdom would later argue about which mistake mattered more. Lily, for her part, blamed the goat. Lily Hartley, 20 years old, Omega herbalist of Thornwick Village. Hair the color of wheat left too long in the sun, a spray of freckles across her nose that she swore came from her grandmother's side, and hands that could set a broken wrist with the gentleness of a lullaby. And yet could not, for reasons no healer had ever explained, carry 2 buckets of water across flat ground without incident. It was market day in the village square, which meant ribbons, strung between the eaves, the blacksmith's hammer ringing 2 streets over, the smell of fresh bread and brined fish competing for dominance over every other scent in Thornwick, and Lily standing on a crate trying to retrieve a love letter from the only goat in Eldermere who had ever developed a taste for parchment. "Mustard," she hissed. "Give it back." Mustard, a goat of considerable opinions and zero loyalty, regarded her with his rectangular pupils and chewed with the slow, insulting confidence of someone who knows he holds the upper hand. A corner of pale blue ribbon, the same ribbon Lady Ava Pemberton had tied around her very private correspondence to a visiting nobleman, dangled from his mouth like a flag of surrender that nobody intended to surrender. Lady Ava Pemberton, 19, daughter of the Thornwick magistrate, beautiful in the practiced, polished way of someone who has been told she is beautiful since birth and has built an entire personality around agreeing. Not cruel, exactly. Simply unaccustomed to wanting something and not receiving it. "That is mine," Ava said, in the particular voice of a woman who had never once in her life had to raise it to be obeyed. "I'm working on it," Lily said, lunging for the ribbon. She did not get the ribbon. She got, instead, a faceful of crate wobble, a half-second of weightlessness that every clumsy person learns to recognize and dread, and then the unmistakable sensation of falling directly backward into old Tompkin's mackerel cart. Old Tompkin, somewhere past 60 and proud of every year of it, the village's loudest fishmonger, more attached to his mackerel than most men are to their own children. Mackerel went everywhere. Across the cobblestones, into a passing dog's delighted jaws, and one, impressively ambitious specimen straight onto Lily's own collarbone, where it draped itself with the smug permanence of a fish that has found its calling. So did Lily's dignity, which landed somewhere near the cartwheels and did not get up. The square went silent, the particular terrible silence of a crowd watching something happen that it will gossip about, for a decade. And into that silence rode the royal procession. Lily, flat on her back with the mackerel still arranged dramatically across her collarbone, opened her eyes to find the entire village bowing, and at the head of 6 mounted riders, looking down at her with an expression caught exactly between alarm and something he was visibly trying not to find funny, sat a man she did not yet know was her king. Alpha King William Ashgrove, 24, ruler of the Ashgrove Pack and, by treaty, the whole of the Eldermere territories. Tall enough that village doorframes had begun to take it personally, built like a man who had spent his childhood being handed a sword instead of a toy, with eyes the deep gray black of a storm not yet arrived. He had a reputation, carefully cultivated by people who had never actually spoken to him, for being cold. He was, in fact, simply tired, and had developed the unfortunate habit of being tired in public. "Are you," he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has been trained since infancy not to laugh at the wrong moment, "in need of assistance?" "I'm being eaten by a fish," Lily said, with the relentless honesty of someone who has not yet processed that she is speaking to her sovereign. "It's fine, this happens." A sound escaped the king, not quite a laugh, more the controlled detonation of one, and behind him the largest, scruffiest hound Lily had ever seen lifted its head from where it trotted alongside the king's horse and said, with absolute clarity and a put-upon sigh, "Finally. Someone interesting." Lily sat bolt upright so fast the mackerel slid off her shoulder. Nobody else so much as blinked. She looked around the square. Ava was still glaring at Mustard. Old Tompkin was mourning his catch with both hands pressed to his face. The 6 mounted riders were politely studying the middle distance, the way one does around an embarrassed monarch. Nobody, not one single person, had reacted to the dog that had just spoken in a voice like gravel and dry wit directly into the center of her skull. The king, for his part, was already turning his horse, already moving on, already pretending, the way kings are taught to pretend, that nothing of note had happened in a fish-strewn village square. The dog looked back at her over his shoulder as the procession departed. "You can hear me," he said, sounding delighted in the way of someone who has just found a very large, very entertaining loophole. Oh, this is going to be wonderful. Lily sat in the wreckage of the fish cart for a long moment after they had gone, mackerel scented and thoroughly bewildered, and decided, the way one decides to ignore a strange noise in the night, that she had simply imagined it. She would be wrong about that for exactly 4 more days. That night, Eldermere Wood was the kind of dark that has weight to it. Lily banked the fire low, latched the shutters against a wind that smelled of coming rain, and was halfway into sleep when something heavy struck her front door. Not a knock, a body. She came awake the way healers learn to, instantly, completely, already moving, and threw the door open with a candle in one hand and absolutely no plan in the other. What lay across her threshold was the largest wolf she had ever seen. White, not black, white as the inside of a shell, fur-soaked dark along one flank with rain and something darker still, and his left fork was clamped in the iron teeth of a poacher's trap, the kind set illegally along the deer trails and never, not once, intended for anything that could think. The wolf's eyes, gray-black, glassy with pain, found hers, and he did not lunge. He did not snarl. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a door he is no longer certain will open, and went still, as if stillness were the only dignity he had left to offer. This is how kings die in stories, Lily thought absurdly, though she could not have said why the word king had occurred to her at all, bleeding on someone's doorstep because they were too proud to run from a trap. "Don't you dare bite me," she said, already kneeling, already reaching for the iron jaws with both hands. "I am about to do something extremely stupid, and I need you to not eat me for it." He let her. That single fact would follow Lily for the rest of her life. Not the trap, not the blood, not even the eyes, but the simple, staggering fact that an animal large enough to take her arm off at the shoulder chose, in the worst moment of its night, to trust a stranger's hands instead of its own teeth. The iron gave with a shriek of metal and a low, terrible sound from the wolf that was not quite a howl. She hauled him. Somehow, impossibly, both of them slipping on the wet step, over the threshold and in front of the fire, and there, by firelight, with rain beginning to whisper against the shutters, Lily Hartley did what she had been trained since girlhood to do. She cleaned a wound. She did not have wolf-sized bandages. She used what she had. Torn linen, yarrow paste, the lavender salve her grandmother swore by for any hurt that bled, and she worked with her hands close to a creature who could have killed her in under a second, narrating the whole time in the soft, steady, nonsense stream voice she used on frightened animals and frightened people alike, because the two were not so different. "You're going to be fine. This is going to sting, and I'm sorry, and you're going to be fine. There, I know. At some point, she could never afterward say precisely when. The wolf's great head came to rest against her knee, heavy and trusting, and something in Lily's chest cracked open in a way she did not yet have a name for. "You poor thing," she whispered, working salve into torn fur with fingers gone gentle from years of practice. "Somebody's missing you tonight. I hope they're worried sick." The cottage filled with small, ordinary sounds, the hiss of damp wood catching, the patter of rain finding new gaps in the shutters, the slow, ragged rhythm of breath easing from pain into something closer to rest. Lily had tended enough broken things in her short life to know the exact moment an animal stops fighting its own survival and simply allows itself to be helped. She felt it now, in the loosening of muscle beneath her palms, in the great body's slow settle against the hearthstones, and something in her own chest settled to match it, as though his calm were contagious. She studied him properly for the first time, now that fear had stopped crowding out curiosity. The impossible white of his coat, paler even than the moon-bleached linen on her line. The scarred notch in one ear, old and long-healed, that spoke of a life lived hard before tonight. The eyes, when they drifted half-shut, the precise gray-black of storm clouds gathering over the eastern ridge. There was something almost familiar in that color, some itch at the edge of memory she could not yet place. And she would think of it again, days later, standing in a fish-strewn square, without quite understanding why. The wolf made a sound, low in his throat, that might almost have been a laugh. Someone is, he thought, in a voice that did not reach her ears. Not that night, not yet, only because he had not yet learned that this particular Omega could hear things that were never meant for her at all. The entire kingdom, currently in considerable detail. He stayed until the fire burned to embers, and her breathing evened into sleep where she sat, slumped against the hearth, one hand still resting on his bandaged leg, as though she meant to keep watch even unconscious. He lay very still in the firelight, listening to the rain ease and the woods settle, and her heartbeat slow into something steady and trusting, and did the single most reckless thing he had done since assuming the crown. he let himself be found. He let himself, for one night, be only a wounded creature, and not a kingdom's worth of duty. And something about the weight of her hand on his leg felt, absurdly, like the first true rest he had taken in years. He left before dawn, the way wounded things do, slipping out into gray light with his legs still throbbing and his mind, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely, helplessly occupied. 3 days later, Daniel Cole found his king standing at the edge of Thornwick Wood, staring at a cottage with smoke curling from its chimney, wearing the expression of a man doing complicated arithmetic he did not want to finish. Daniel Cole, 26, beta of the Ashgrove Pack, William's oldest friend since boyhood, and the only man in the kingdom permitted to mock his king to his face. Built like a barn door, grins like one too. "You've been standing here," Daniel said, "for 40 minutes. I am surveying the territory." "You are surveying a chimney." Daniel followed his gaze, then leaned against the nearest tree with the settled patience of a man who intends to enjoy this. "Is this about the healer? The one from the fish cart?" William did not answer, which Daniel correctly understood to be an answer. Beside them, Biscuit, the hound, presently lying in the leaf litter with the air of a creature deeply unimpressed by both men, lifted his head. Biscuit, age and origin disputed. He claims to be older than the kingdom itself. This is almost certainly a lie. William's guardhound since puphood, cursed by a wandering hedge witch as a joke that nobody found funny except apparently Biscuit. He can speak mind to anyone within earshot, except that some quirk of the curse, or of bloodline, or of cosmic mischief, means that only Lily Hartley has ever been able to hear him. He has opinions on everyone and shares them liberally. He's been like this since the wolf came home with a bandaged leg smelling of lavender. Biscuit informed no one in particular, since no one in particular could hear him. Won't talk about it. Sighs at windows. It's pathetic, frankly, and I've watched this man negotiate a border treaty without blinking. William shot the dog a look that would have withered a lesser creature. Biscuit, who had been withered by better men than William Ashgrove, was unmoved. "I require," William said carefully, to Daniel an excuse to visit the healer's cottage. Officially. Daniel grinned the grin of a man who has just been handed the single best piece of gossip of his career. "You require an excuse. There may be unrest regarding poachers' traps along the southern trail line. A king should investigate such things personally." "A king," Biscuit said, trotting ahead toward the cottage with his tail held at an angle of pure smugness, "should also learn to lie better, but we work with what we have." Lily was elbow-deep in drying lavender when someone knocked. Actually knocked, with knuckles, like a person, and she opened the door to find the king from the fish cart incident standing on her step with an expression of profound formality, and the same enormous white-furred dog trotting at his heel, looking, if a dog could look such a thing, extremely amused. "Lily Hartley," William said, "I am told you tend a stretch of the southern trail. I've come regarding the poacher's traps." "Have you?" Lily said, looking him up and down with the frank, unhurried curiosity of a woman who has already decided this man is hiding something and is mostly entertained by it. "Funny, you don't look like a man who chases traps personally." "He doesn't." Biscuit offered helpfully, sitting down at William's boot and looking up at her with bright conspiratorial eyes. "He sent 4 riders to do that last month and complained the entire time about the paperwork. He's here because he can't stop thinking about your cottage and is far too proud to simply say so." Lily's mouth fell open. William, who could not hear a word of this, noted with some confusion that the omega before him had gone the particular shade of crimsons that suggests either fever or extreme embarrassment, and asked, with real concern, "Are you well?" "I'm—" Lily looked at the dog. The dog looked back, tail wagging with shameless delight. "Your dog just told me you're too proud to admit you wanted to see my cottage." Silence fell across the clearing in a way that felt, to William, very much like the floor of the world tilting sideways. "What?" William said. "Oh, this is the best day of my life," Biscuit announced, flopping dramatically onto his back in the leaf litter. Finally someone to talk to who isn't required by law to nod along. "Do you know how long I've waited? Do you have any idea how insufferable it is? Living with a man who broods at fence posts for entertainment." "Aye, he says you brood at fence posts." Lily was fighting and losing, a smile. "For entertainment." William closed his eyes briefly, as though praying for patience from a god who had clearly already left the building. "Biscuit," he said with the weary precision of long practice, "has been cursed since puphood to speak directly into the minds of those nearby. No one has ever been able to hear him. Not my mother, not my generals, Not a single soul in 24 years. Well, Lily said, leaning against her own doorframe, arms crossed, clearly deciding in real time that this was the best thing to happen to her all month. Lucky me. Lucky you, Biscuit agreed. He once cried during a sad ballad and tried to claim it was pollen. In spring. Indoors. I did not, William said, with the particular vehemence of a man defending an indefensible truth. And Lily Hartley laughed. Bright, unguarded. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere a person doesn't usually let strangers see. And something in William's chest, careful and locked for 24 years, shifted very quietly on its hinges. He stayed an hour longer than any trail inspection required, asking questions that had nothing to do with traps. What herbs grew best in shade, whether the goat had a name beyond simple insult, how a woman came to live alone at the edge of a wood without a single soul to complain to about it, and left eventually with the distinct and unfamiliar sensation of a man who has just discovered a door in his own life he had not known was there, and is already, helplessly, looking forward to opening it again. It was a full week before the white wolf returned, and he returned, fittingly, because of mud. Lily had taken to leaving a bowl of water by her step. For the foxes, she told herself, though she had never once seen a fox drink from it. And on the 7th evening, as a storm rolled gray and heavy off the western hills, the same wolf from the trap night limped out of the trees, soaked through, exhausted, and entirely too large for the bowl he was clearly too proud to use. Oh, there you are, Lily said, abandoning her supper without a second thought and crossing the yard in her stocking feet, heedless of the mud. I wondered if I'd dreamed you. Come here, come on. Inside, you absolute disaster. The wolf hesitated at her threshold the way he had not hesitated the night of the trap, ears flat, posture wary in a way that had nothing to do with pain, and everything to do with something Lily could not yet name. Don't you dare argue with me, she said, hauling the door wide. I have rules. Rule 1, no bleeding on my floor unless absolutely necessary. Rule 2, you're getting a bath because you smell like the bottom of a lake and I am not having that in my home. The wolf looked, for one suspended moment, exactly like a man being told an unbearable truth. Is that? Lily narrowed her eyes. Are you scared of baths? A muscle in his jaw. Wolf jaws do not, strictly, have muscles that twitch like that, and Lily would think about this detail for days afterward without quite letting herself draw the conclusion it deserved. Flickered. You absolute coward, she said, delighted, already dragging the wash tub from its corner. The biggest wolf in Eldermere, terrified of soap. He lost the argument. Lily Hartley, it turned out, was not a woman who lost arguments with stubborn animals. She had been winning them against goats for 20 years, and a wolf, however enormous, stood no chance. Warm water sloshed over white fur gone gray with mud and rain. Lavender-scented suds rose in clouds, clinging to her forearms, to the loose strands of hair that had escaped her braid hours ago, to the worn wooden rim of a tub that had bathed nothing larger than a lamb until tonight. Lily worked with the brisk, unselfconscious efficiency of a woman tending livestock, narrating the entire process to a creature she fully believed could not understand a word. Honestly, you're worse than Mustard. At least Mustard doesn't sulk about it. And somewhere in the middle of scrubbing mud from behind one impossibly soft ear, she paused. You know, she said, quieter now, firelight gold across the water. I keep thinking I should be afraid of you. Great enormous thing like you could have my arm off without trying. But I'm not. Isn't that strange? The wolf went very still beneath her hands. Because I would let you take it, he thought in the silence of his own skull where she could not hear him. Not in this form. Not without the same cosmic accident that let her hear Biscuit. Before I would ever let myself hurt you. He did not say it. He could not say it, not as a wolf, not yet. But something passed, between them anyway, wordless and warm as the bathwater. And Lily found herself leaning her forehead, just briefly, against his great damp head. The wolf did not pull away. He breathed her in instead. Lavender, wood smoke, the particular warmth of a hand that had never once flinched from him. And something in his chest, locked tighter than any treasury, came undone by a single inch. He fell asleep by her fire that night, a thing he had not done willingly, unguarded in longer than he could remember, and it was that, not the trap, not the bath itself, that would undo him entirely before the night was through. She woke first. The fire had burned to a low red eye in the hearth, and the storm outside had gentled to a patient drizzle. And Lily blinked awake against the wall she'd fallen asleep beside to find that the wolf was gone. In his place, half tangled in the same blanket she had thrown over his wet fur hours before, lay a man. He was bare to the waist, dark hair damp against his brow, one arm flung out across the floorboards exactly where a foreleg had lain only moments before, and the firelight caught the line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, and, when his eyes opened, slow and disoriented, to find her staring, the same deep gray-black storm color she had last seen looking down at her from a horse in a fish-strewn square. For one full, suspended heartbeat, neither of them moved. "You," Lily said, very faintly, "are not a wolf." "I am," William said, with the particular helplessness of a man caught entirely without his usual armor of crowns and careful words. "Occasionally. It's complicated. You are the king. Also occasionally. Equally complicated." Lily sat back against the wall, both hands pressed to her mouth, and went through, in rapid and visible succession, every stage of realization a person can go through in under a minute. Shock, disbelief, a furious sort of embarrassment at every nonsense thing she had ever said to him while he was four-legged and listening, and finally, helplessly, a laugh that broke out of her like something escaping a cage. "I called you worse than my goat," she said. "I scrubbed behind your ears." "You did," William agreed, with the dignity of a man who has accepted his fate. "Thoroughly." "I told you secrets. I told a wolf. I told you that I haven't loved anyone foolishly enough to worry about since my grandmother died, and you just lay there and let me." "I would do it again," William said. Quiet now, the laughter, gone out of his voice entirely, replaced something far more dangerous. "Every word of it. I have not slept that easily by a fire since I was a boy too young to understand what a crown costs a person." Lily stopped laughing. The storm had eased to almost nothing outside, just the soft percussion of water finding its way off the eaves, and in the hush of it William sat up slowly, the blanket falling from one shoulder, and could reach for her, did not move closer, simply let himself be seen. Fully, finally, without fur or formality between them, as if seeing were the only honesty he had left to offer. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I told myself I would, the first night, before I left. And then I told myself again the second time. I am, it turns out, exceptionally good at telling myself things I have no intention of doing. Why didn't you? Because as a wolf I am only ever a wolf to you. No crown, no kingdom, no treaty waiting to be signed or border waiting to be defended." His mouth curved, rueful. "I have not been only a man in front of anyone since I was perhaps 12 years old, Lily Hartley. I was not eager to give that up." Lily looked at him for a long moment, soot-dark hair, storm-colored eyes. A king sitting on her cottage floor in a borrowed blanket, with the particular vulnerability of someone who has just handed over the one secret he has spent his whole life guarding, and felt the last of her anger dissolve into something far softer and far more dangerous than fury. She thought, absurdly, of the night in the square, the same gray-black eyes looking down at her from horseback, careful and contained, while every part of him that mattered had stayed hidden behind a crown's worth of good manners. She thought of the wolf's eyes, half shut by her fire, that had struck her as familiar in a way she could not place. They were, of course, the same eyes. They had always been the same eyes. She had simply never been permitted, until tonight, to see both halves of the same man looking back at her at once. "You're going to have to explain this properly," she said at last, drawing her knees up, settling in against the wall as though preparing for a long story, because some part of her recognized that this conversation deserved more than a hurried apology by firelight. All of it. Not the king parts. I can guess the king parts, the wolf parts. So he told her, haltingly at first, then with more ease than he had expected, the words coming easier to a woman who had already seen him at his most wounded, and had not once flinched. He told her of the old Ashgrove bloodline, of the second shape that came to certain alphas and had come to him since boyhood, a thing his father had called a gift, and his tutors had called a burden, and he himself had simply learned to carry quietly, the way one carries any truth too large to explain to people who only ever wanted a king. He told her how rarely he allowed himself the wolf at all, these days. How the trap that first night had caught him on one of the few evenings he'd slipped away from the castle simply to remember briefly what it felt like to move through the world without a crown's weight pressing down on every step. "Well," she said finally, "you'd better get dressed before Biscuit wakes up and tells the entire forest you slept on my floor." "Too late," came a smug voice from the doorway, where the hound had apparently been awake and listening for some time. "I've already composed several songs about it." Spring crept toward Eldermere Wood with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be, and so, in its own way, did William. Knowing what he was changed nothing and everything at once. He came as a man more often now, checking the southern trail, he claimed, with diminishing conviction. And as a wolf still, on the nights he could not bear the distance between his own cold rooms and her warm hearth, because Lily had told him plainly that she did not mind which shape he wore, only that he kept coming back. Biscuit came always, delighted beyond measure with his new audience, and made it his personal mission to humiliate his king as thoroughly and as often as possible. "He kept your knitted scarf," Biscuit announced one afternoon, apropos of nothing, while William was occupied arguing with Mustard over a stolen glove. "The crooked blue one you made him as a joke. Says it's a gift to be polite. Wears it under his cloak so his guards don't see. I have personally watched him straighten it in a mirror." "I do not," William called, without turning around, in the exact tone of a man who absolutely did. "He also," Biscuit continued, warming to his subject the way only a century's cursed hound with a captive audience can, "once practiced an entire conversation with you out loud. To me, at length. I was extremely bored." Lily, who had been elbow-deep in bread dough, went very still. "He practice?" "For 40 minutes, Biscuit confirmed with the smug satisfaction of a creature who knows exactly how much chaos he is causing and has decided he likes it. "He's hopeless. It's been a joy to watch." William, glove finally recovered from a smug and unrepentant Mustard, turned just in time to see Lily fighting verbally, this not to smile, and understood, too late, as he always seemed to understand things where she was concerned, exactly what had been said about him in his absence. "Whatever he told you," he said, with the particular dignity of a man trying to salvage a sinking ship, "is almost certainly true, and I would ask you to forget it regardless. He told me you practiced a conversation with me, for 40 minutes. I would ask you to forget it especially." Lily laughed, that same bright, unguarded sound, and reached out, flour-dusted and entirely unself-conscious, to brush a smear of dough from his sleeve, and the touch lingered half a second longer than either of them quite intended, and neither of them quite pulled away first. It was, Daniel would say later, the worst-kept secret in the entire Ashgrove pack within the month. The king who visited a healer's cottage to discuss trail safety with such suspicious regularity, the healer who had started keeping a second teacup on her shelf, just in case. The hound who delighted in narrating every embarrassing detail to the one person alive who could hear him, with the gleeful thoroughness of a man, or dog, who has waited 2 decades for someone to finally laugh at his jokes. What followed was not, by any measure a bard would put to song, an eventful stretch of time. There was no battle in it, no grand declaration, nothing a traveling minstrel could easily rhyme. And yet, looking back, both of them would name it among the happiest months of their lives. Because love, Lily was beginning to learn, rarely announces itself with trumpets. More often it arrives in the small, accumulating evidence of a person choosing you, quietly, again and again. It arrived in the way William learned without ever being told that she took her tea with too much honey and pretended otherwise. It arrived in the callus that formed, slow and unglamorous, on his sword hand from the afternoons he spent helping her split firewood instead of letting a servant do it, because some stubborn, unspoken part of him needed his hands to be useful to her in ways a crown never required. It arrived in the way Lily began, without quite noticing, saving the prettiest wildflowers she found on her morning rounds. Not to sell, not even consciously to keep, but simply because some part of her had already decided whose table they belonged on. He taught her, one golden afternoon, to ride, patient and laughing in equal measure as she gripped the reins of his gentlest mare with white-knuckled determination, and informed him with great seriousness that horses were simply goats who had gotten ideas above their station. She taught him, in turn, to identify the difference between a fever that needed willow bark and one that needed rest and broth and nothing more, crouched together over an ailing village child until the small girl's color returned, and William looked at Lily with an expression so unguarded that even Biscuit, for once, said nothing at all. There were quieter lessons, too, the kind neither of them announced or even fully noticed they were teaching. William learned, watching her move through her small-foot-crowded cottage, that competence could be its own kind of beauty, that a woman setting a bone with steady hands was no less remarkable than any court dancer he'd ever admired from a careful, royal distance. Lily learned, in turn, watching him crouch in the dirt beside a frightened farm dog or carry a sleeping child 3 miles without complaint, that the coldness the village whispered about had never been coldness at all, only a man who had simply never been given anywhere safe to set it down. "I am choosing," the hound informed her privately, on one of these quiet evenings, watching William carry a sleeping farm boy back to his mother's cottage with the same careful tenderness he'd once shown a wounded leg by her fire, not to comment on that particular look on his face. "You're welcome." That's very restrained of you. I contain multitudes, Biscuit said with great dignity, and then immediately undercut it by adding, he also tripped over a bucket yesterday because he was watching you instead of the path. I will be commenting on that one extensively, for years, possibly at the wedding. There was, in all of this, a season of small things, and beneath the small things, growing as quietly and persistently as the lavender in Lily's garden, something neither of them yet had the courage to name aloud, though both of them, in their separate ways, had already begun to understand exactly what it was. There were evenings, too, that belonged to no one but themselves. When William arrived as a man and stayed past sundown not because duty required it, but because he had simply run out of reasons to leave, and the two of them sat on her step watching the stars come up over Thornwick Wood, while Biscuit, for once, said nothing at all, content to lie in the grass and let the silence belong to them. On one such evening, William reached over without preamble and tucked a stray curl behind her ear, an utterly unremarkable gesture that nonetheless left them both startled into stillness, as though some unspoken boundary had been quietly, mutually redrawn. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them needed to. It simply became, after that, a thing his hand did sometimes, without asking permission, and a thing she had stopped expecting an apology for. Sophia Marsh, 21, blacksmith's daughter, Lily's oldest friend, loud in the way of someone who has spent her whole life shouting over forge fire, and has never quite learned to turn the volume back down. Loyal as iron, blunt as a hammer, and entirely unable to mind her own business where Lily's heart is concerned. You're glowing, Sophia announced, dropping onto Lily's bench without invitation, the way she did everything. Don't argue. I've known you since we were 6. You're glowing like a woman who's been kissed, or wants to be. I have not been kissed. Wants to be, then. Sophia grinned wide and knowing. It's the king, isn't it? Don't bother lying, half the village has clocked it. Martha says he rode past her bakery 4 times last week and bought bread he clearly didn't need. Lily put her face in her hands. It's complicated. Complicated how? He's the most eligible man in 6 territories, he visits you constantly, and I hear his dog won't shut up about how soft he's gone since meeting you. Sophia paused. Wait, how do you hear about the dog? That, Lily said, is the complicated part. She told her everything. The trap, the bath, the morning the fire burned low, and a wolf became a man on her cottage floor. The voice in her head that nobody else could hear, and Sophia listened with the rapt, scandalized delight of someone hearing the best story of her life. So, Sophia said finally, let me see if I understand. You've been falling in love with a king who turned out to secretly be the wolf you'd been tending, who you've personally bathed, while his cursed talking dog narrates his every embarrassing feeling directly into your skull. Yes. Lily. Sophia took both her hands, dead serious for once. This is without question the most ridiculous thing that has ever happened to anyone in Thornwick, including the year the well caught fire, and I think you should marry him. There came an evening, and Lily would return to this evening often in memory in the years after, the way one returns to a particular warm room in a house long since moved out of. When William arrived as himself, dust of the road still on his boots, and found her struggling, with great and colorful frustration, to teach herself the steps to a court dance from a borrowed instruction booklet. You're doing it wrong, he said from the doorway, before he could stop himself. I am trying, Lily said with dignity, from where she had just trodden on her own foot. Not everyone was raised with a dancing master, Your Majesty. William, he corrected, for what was easily the 40th time. And you're leading. That's your error. You're meant to follow. I don't know how to follow. I've never had anyone worth following. It was said lightly, a joke half-formed, and yet it landed in the quiet cottage with a weight neither of them expected. William crossed the room before he had consciously decided to and held out his hand. Bare, uncrowned, simply a hand, and said, Lo, then let me show you. Her fingers found his. His other hand settled, careful as a held breath, at her waist. The booklet lay forgotten on the table, its pages stirring faintly in the draught from the chimney, as forgotten as every other piece of court instruction William had ever tried, and failed to apply to this particular woman. They were, by any honest account, terrible at it. Lily stepped on his boot twice. William, who had danced at 100 state functions with flawless, bored precision, found himself entirely unable to remember the steps with her this close, her laughter warm against his collarbone, the scent of lavender rising from her hair exactly as it had the night he'd lain bleeding on her floor, and decided, somewhere in the depths of the pain, that he would find his way back here no matter what it cost him. He had partnered duchesses and visiting princesses across marble floors, without once losing count of a measure. He lost count 3 times within the first minute of a lopsided cottage dance, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he did not mind in the least. "You're staring," Lily said, breathless, mid-turn. "I'm concentrating. You're staring, William." He did not deny it a second time. Instead, with the particular courage of a man who has faced armies and found this far more frightening, he stopped moving entirely, and so did she, and the space between them narrowed to something measured in inches, in heartbeats, in the small unsteady catch of her breath. "I hate to interrupt," announced Biscuit, materializing in the doorway with all the subtlety of a falling tree, "but Mustard has eaten the curtains, and I feel that is more urgent than whatever this is." William closed his eyes. Lily, scarlet, buried her face against his shoulder and laughed until she had to sit down, and the moment, fragile, golden, nearly kissed, dissolved into goat-related chaos, which both of them would later agree was, in its own ridiculous way, exactly right. Some things deserved to arrive slowly. This, they both understood without saying it, was going to be one of them. Trouble arrived as it so often does, wearing very fine boots. Charles Rain, 28, alpha of the neighboring Rain pack, visiting Eldermere under the banner of border diplomacy, though everyone with eyes understood his true purpose within an hour of his arrival. Handsome in the sharp, calculating way of a man who has never once needed to be kind to get what he wants, and ambitious enough to want the Ashgrove territories joined to his own, by treaty if possible, by marriage if necessary. Charles arrived at court with gifts, with flattery, and with a quiet, persistent suggestion that the Ashgrove pack would benefit enormously from an alliance, sealed, naturally, through Lady Ava Pemberton, whose family connections and whose evident willingness made her, in Charles's calculating opinion, the obvious bridge between the two territories. He did not much care which alpha married her. He simply needed a marriage, and was content to let politics sort out the details. Ava, for her part, found herself courted with sudden and suspicious enthusiasm by the visiting alpha, and discovered to her own surprise that she did not entirely hate it. But court gossip moves faster than truth ever does, and by the time it reached Lily, second-hand, garbled, delivered by a well-meaning but breathless Sophia, it had become something else entirely, that the king was to be married, that an alliance was being arranged with Lady Ava, that the cottage visits would, of necessity, end. Gossip, Lily would reflect later, was a strange and merciless alchemy. It took a man's flat, repeated refusal and somehow rendered it, 3 retellings later, as the opposite. Lily did not see William for 4 days. William, in those same 4 days, was occupied almost entirely with refusing Charles Rain. In council, in private, in increasingly blunt language, he would later be obliged to apologize for. While Charles smiled and rephrased the same proposal a dozen different ways, the way a man does when he has not yet accepted that no means no. When Biscuit finally found Lily, alone in her garden, refusing to meet his eyes even though he could not technically meet them with words, his usual mischief had drained entirely away. "You think he's marrying her," Biscuit said, quiet for the first time since she'd known him. "That's why you've stopped answering the door." "I haven't stopped answering it. He hasn't knocked. He's been buried in council for 4 days because Charles Rain is trying to bully him into an alliance he doesn't want, with a woman he has never once looked at the way he looks at you," Biscuit said. "I have watched this man for 24 years, Lily Hartley. I have watched him be cold and careful and entirely alone, because that is what kings are taught to be. I have never, not once, watched him practice a conversation in a mirror for anyone else. Do you understand me? Not once." Lily's throat tightened. "Then why hasn't he told me himself?" "Because," Biscuit said, with the weary patience of a creature who has spent 2 decades translating a stubborn man's silences, "he is, despite ruling an entire kingdom, an absolute coward about the one thing that actually frightens him. Which, infuriatingly, is you." Charles Rain, it transpired, was not a man inclined to wait politely for a marriage to be arranged through proper channels. He came to Lily's cottage himself 3 days later, smiling the smile of a man entirely unused to being told no, and made his intentions. Not romantic, never that, simply strategic, perfectly clear. She was, he had observed, a distraction the Alpha King could not afford. He suggested, with the silken courtesy of true menace, that perhaps an Omega healer ought to remember her place, and that certain trail permits, certain village protections, certain small mercies extended by the crown to a remote cottage, could quite easily be reconsidered. It was, in short, a threat wearing the clothing of a friendly visit. Lily listened to it all without her smile slipping once. pouring water from the kettle with a hand so steady it would have unnerved a less confident man than Charles Rain. Though it ought, perhaps, to have unnerved him anyway, had he known her better. She had grown up in a cottage full of jars labeled in her grandmother's careful hand, jars that could soothe a fever or stop a bleed, or, when circumstances called for it, teach a man an extremely memorable lesson about underestimating quiet women. Charles, watching her hands move with the unhurried competence of someone entirely unbothered, mistook her calm for compliance. It was, Lily reflected later, the single most useful mistake he could have made. Lily, who had spent 20 years being underestimated by people who mistook her clumsiness for harmlessness, smiled back with the particular calm of a healer who knows precisely which herbs in her garden are merely unpleasant, and which are genuinely dangerous, and offered him tea. "Don't," Biscuit warned, who had trailed Charles's party at William's order, and arrived just in time to watch this unfold. "Lily, whatever you're about to do, relax," Lily said pleasantly, to a dog only she could hear, while pouring with a steady hand. "It's only valerian, chamomile, and a generous helping of something that will have him apologizing to every chicken in this village by sundown. He'll be perfectly fine," profoundly embarrassed. But fine. Charles, who had no idea he was being narrated to, drank his tea with the smug confidence of a man accustomed to winning, and within the hour was discovered by his own guards weeping with theatrical sincerity at a fence post, apologizing at length to Mustard for underestimating the strength of small things, and could not, for the life of him, remember why he had thought threatening a sovereign's healer in his own territory had ever seemed wise. William arrived at the cottage that evening to find Charles's humiliated retinue already departing Eldermere in some haste, and Lily on her step, arms crossed, entirely unrepentant. "I am told," William said carefully, fighting a smile he had no business fighting, "that Alpha Rain wept at a fence post. Valerian does that to people who annoy me." She tilted her head. "Funny. Most people who threaten me don't get tea." "Remind me," William said, "never to threaten you. You couldn't if you tried." Her smile faded, something more uncertain rising beneath it. "William, I heard, they're saying you're to marry Ava. For the alliance." The relief in his face when he understood, finally, what had kept her 4 days silent, was so plain that Lily felt something in her chest unknot all at once. "I have refused that alliance," he said. "In every form Charles Rain has proposed it, from the very first day he raised it. I did not come to tell you because I assumed, wrongly I see now, that you already knew there was nothing to tell." He stepped closer, the careful distance of days finally, deliberately closing. "There has never been anyone else, Lily. Not since the night you pulled iron out of my leg and called me a poor thing while threatening a creature that could have killed you." "You let it," she said softly. "You let me. I would let you do far worse," he said, "and call it a privilege." She studied him a moment longer, the last of her doubt finally loosening its grip, replaced by something warmer and far more certain. "4 days of silence," she said, "for a misunderstanding you didn't even cause. You really are hopeless at this, you know." Biscuit was right. "Biscuit," William said with great dignity, "is on this single occasion regrettably correct, and I would ask that this never be repeated to him directly. It happened, fittingly, by Silver Brook at the wood's edge, beneath the kind of dusk that turns ordinary water to poured gold. Neither of them had planned it. Lily had only come to gather watercress. William had only come because Biscuit had, with shameless and deliberate scheming, suggested it was the perfect evening for a walk and then conveniently wandered off to investigate a smell, leaving the two of them entirely, suspiciously alone. He did that on purpose, Lily said, watching the hound's tail vanish into the brush. He has been doing that on purpose for 2 months, William admitted. I've stopped fighting it. They settled on the bank in companionable silence, the kind that no longer needed filling, and it was there, with the brook murmuring and the light turning everything the color of warm honey, that Lily finally said the things she had been carrying, since the morning the fire burned low, and a wolf became a man on her floor. She had rehearsed it, in fact, several times, alone in her garden, half to the lavender, half to a god she wasn't entirely certain was listening, and every version had sounded in the rehearsing far braver than it felt now, sitting close enough to smell the cedar and wood smoke that always clung to him, close enough to see the small betraying tension in his jaw that meant he, too, was bracing for something. I think I loved you before I knew your name, she said. Is that foolish? William turned to look at her fully, and something in his gray-black eyes she had stared into across a bathtub, across a dance, across every quiet evening since, caught the dying light and flared, slow and unmistakable, into gold. Lily's breath stopped entirely. What? It's the mate bond, William said, and his voice had gone rough, astonished, as though he had spent his whole life being told a story he half believed and had just watched it become true in front of him. It only happens once. When it's certain. He reached for her hand, gold-eyed and unguarded in a way she had never once seen him allow himself to be, not even as a wolf bleeding on her floor. I have known since the bath, Lily Hartley. Known what I felt, if not what it meant. I think some part of me has known since you threw open your door to a wounded animal you had every reason to fear, and chose to help instead. You could have just said, she managed, half lawing, half undone. I am a king, William said, with the particular wry helplessness of a man who has just admitted his own greatest weakness, trained from birth to control every word I speak in front of others. You are the only person alive who has ever made that training entirely useless. His thumb traced once, gently, across her knuckles. I am asking you now properly, with my own voice, and no dog to do it for me. Stay. Be mine. Let me spend the rest of my reign learning how to be worth the trouble I've caused you. Lily Hartley, clumsy, stubborn, unshakably kind, answered the only way that had ever made sense since the night a wounded white wolf chose her doorstep over the entire rest of the forest. She kissed him. Somewhere in the brush, an extremely smug hound allowed himself, just this once, a single victorious bark. They married in early summer beneath an arch of woven lavender that Lily had insisted upon, and no court tradition could talk her out of, in a ceremony attended by villagers who still, occasionally, called their new queen the fish cart girl, with deep and abiding affection. The cottage where it had all begun stood empty that morning for the first time in months, its hearth cold, its washtub stowed neatly in its corner, as though even the small wooden house understood that its part in the story, while never forgotten, had finally given way to a much larger room full of much louder people. Sophia stood as Lily's witness, weeping loudly and without embarrassment, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had embroidered herself badly, with what she insisted was a goat, and everyone else agreed, looked more like an indignant sheep. Daniel stood as Williams, and spent the entire ceremony grinning like a man who had personally arranged the whole affair, which, in fairness, he largely had. It was Daniel, after all, who had first suggested the trail safety excuse, and Daniel who would remind William of that fact at every opportunity for the rest of both their lives. Ava sat near the front, quieter than anyone expected, and beside her sat Lord Robert Fay, 26, a soft-spoken envoy from the Eastern Hills who had come to Eldermere on minor border business weeks earlier and had, somewhere in the course of 3 accidental dinners and 1 very long conversation about falconry, found himself unable to leave again. Where Charles Raine had wanted Ava as a bridge between territories, Robert simply wanted Ava, and the difference, Ava had discovered to her own quiet astonishment, made all the difference in the world. And Biscuit, permitted by special royal decree to attend the ceremony despite Daniel's strenuous objections regarding dignity, sat at the foot of the altar and narrated the entire event directly into the bride's mind with the gleeful, uncensored commentary of a creature who had waited 24 years for an audience and intended to make full use of it for the rest of his very long life. He practiced his vows for an hour this morning, Biscuit reported solemnly, as Lily walked the aisle. Cried once, blamed pollen. It is summer, Lily Hartley. There is no pollen excuse left to him. I can hear that, William murmured, not turning his head, gold-eyed and radiant in a way no crown had ever made him. I'm aware, Biscuit said. It's the best part. When the ceremony ended and the vows were spoken and the kiss that sealed them lasted, by Sophia's loud and delighted count, several seconds longer than strictly proper, Mustard, who had, against everyone's express wishes, been smuggled into the festivities by a co-conspiring kitchen boy, chose that precise moment to wander up the aisle and eat an entire corner of the wedding lavender, ribbon and all. The new queen of Eldermere laughed until she had to lean against her husband to stay standing, and the new king, gold-eyed, lavender-scented, entirely undone by a woman who had once thrown a bucket's worth of accidental affection over his wolf-formed dignity, laughed right along with her. A sound, those closest to the altar would later swear, that none of them had ever once heard from their famously composed sovereign, before this particular bride had wandered, mackerel-scented and unrepentant, into his life, several years later beside the same brook. Years later, travelers passing through Eldermere would hear the story told a dozen different ways in a dozen different taverns. The healer who bathed a wolf and didn't know it was the king, the dog who could speak to no one but her, the goat who ate the wedding ribbon, the alpha who wept at a fence post and never lived it down. Some versions had the wolf 9 feet tall. Some had the dog cursed by a dragon instead of a hedge witch. Lily, who heard a particularly creative rendition once at a roadside inn and did not correct a single detail, privately considered this the truest measure of her own happiness. That her life had become, to strangers, a story worth improving upon. What the stories rarely captured, because some things resist being captured in tavern songs, was the particular, ordinary magic of a summer evening years on, when Queen Lily of Eldermere sat on the bank of Silver Brook with two small children chasing fireflies at the water's edge, and an enormous, graying, thoroughly unrepentant hound lying across her feet, narrating their antics with the same shameless commentary he had offered since the day a fish landed on her collarbone in a crowded square. "Your daughter," Biscuit informed her, with the weary fondness of an old friend, "has just informed your son that she intends to marry a frog. He is taking it very personally." "Tell her congratulations," Lily said, not looking up from the bread she was kneading for tomorrow, "and tell him to stop crying about it. His father did the exact same thing over a goat once." "I will be repeating that line to him," Biscuit said with evident relish, "for the rest of his natural life." "I heard that," William called, from where he stood at the tree line, gold-eyed in the dusk, watching his family with the unguarded, helpless warmth of a man who had once believed happiness was something earned only after every duty was finished, and had learned, slowly, stubbornly, one lavender-scented evening at a time, that it had been waiting for him all along, on a cottage doorstep, in the shape of a clumsy omega and a dog with entirely too much to say. He crossed the grass, sat down beside his wife, and said nothing at all, because after everything, after the trap and the bath and the dance and the gold-eyed dusk by the brook, there was, for once, nothing that needed saying. Somewhere past the tree line, their son had given up his protest and joined his sister in the hunt for fireflies, his earlier heartbreak forgotten the way only a child's heartbreak can be, and the sound of their laughter carried bright and easy over the water, the same water that had once turned ordinary dusk to poured gold on the evening. William's eyes first changed color in front of the only woman who had ever made that change possible. Biscuit naturally said it for him anyway. "He's thinking about the fish cart again," the hound reported to the only person in the world who had ever been able to hear him. "He always does, this time of evening. Sentimental old fool," he says, and I quote because I find this extremely funny, that it was the moment he stopped being only a king and started, slowly, becoming a man worth knowing. "Tell him," Lily said, smiling against her husband's shoulder, "that I worked that out for myself a long time ago. He's only just catching up." Lily only smiled, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and watched the fireflies rise gold over the water, exactly where they belonged. Bonus scene. The royal nursery incident. 3 years into their marriage, King William Ashgrove had faced down poachers, hostile alphas, and a particularly aggressive goat. Nothing had prepared him for bath time with a 2-year-old. "Hold still," he said, for the 4th time as his daughter Rosalind shrieked with laughter and flung a wooden duck directly at his crown, which he had, against all royal protocol, worn into the nursery 'cause Biscuit had bet him he wouldn't. "You're losing," Biscuit informed him from his customary spot by the door, watching with the deep satisfaction of a creature who had waited 3 years for this particular form of entertainment. "Badly. A toddler has bested the Alpha King of Eldermere. I'm composing a ballad. She started it, she's 2, she starts everything. That's the job." Lily appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, trying very hard not to smile at the sight of her husband, soaked to the elbows, crown askew, one sock mysteriously missing, losing a war of attrition against a very small, very determined child. "I go to check on bread for 10 minutes, she said. "And come back to this. She weaponized the duck. She's your daughter. Of course she did." Lily crouched down, scooped Rosalind out of the water with the easy competence of a woman who had bathed far larger and far more uncooperative creatures, and wrapped her in a towel. "You know, for a man who once negotiated a border treaty without blinking, you're remarkably bad at this. Border treaties don't bite. Rosalind bit you?" She attempted to. I evaded. Barely. Biscuit made a sound that might have been a laugh, if dogs could laugh with quite that much smugness. "He's been complaining about this all week. Wouldn't admit it to your face, obviously. Told me instead, at length, while brushing his own horse, which is somehow worse than talking to a wall because at least a wall doesn't repeat everything to his wife. I do not complain. You called bath time a campaign I am currently losing. Your exact words. I wrote it down." William closed his eyes with the long-suffering patience of a man who had accepted, 3 years ago, that he would never again have a private thought in his own castle. "I would like it on record that I am an excellent father." "You are," Lily said, kissing the top of Rosalind's damp head. An excellent father who is terrified of bath time and once asked a stable hand for advice on hair braiding, and then denied it when I asked. That was a private conversation. Nothing is private when you live with that dog. I resent the implication, Biscuit said, that I am the problem when you are the one who married a man incapable of lying convincingly to save his own dignity. Later that evening, once Rosalind and her younger brother Aldrich, 3 months old, and, according to Biscuit, already smarter than his father, which is a low bar admittedly, were finally asleep, William found Lily on the cottage steps of their old home, the one they still kept exactly as it had been, lavender and all, for evenings just like this one. You kept the washtub, he said, settling beside her. Sentimental value. She leaned into his shoulder. Someone very stubborn once refused to get in it. I recall being coerced. You recall being a coward about soap, and I recall winning. He laughed. The real laugh, low and unguarded. The one she'd spent years teaching him he was allowed to have, and pulled her closer, the crown he'd forgotten to remove tilting further sideways in the process. Rosalind takes after you, he said. Fearless. Stubborn. Entirely unbothered by anything twice her size. She takes after her grandmother, actually. My mother once chased a bear off the herb garden with a broom. Lily tilted her head up at him, firelight from the open door catching gold in his eyes the way it still did. Every time, after all these years. Aldrich takes after you, though. Cries the moment anyone raises their voice, then pretends it was something in his eye. That is a family trait I refuse to acknowledge. You cried at your own wedding, Pauline. In summer, indoors. I was there, William. From inside the cottage, Biscuit's voice drifted out, warm with the particular fondness of a very old friend, who had watched this entire story unfold from a fish cart to a firelit doorstep, and never once regretted a single moment of the chaos in between. For the record, he announced to no one but Lily, tail thumping lazily against the floorboards. He is currently thinking that this, right here tonight, is worth more than every crown he's ever worn. He won't say it. He never says the good ones out loud. But I hear everything, and I thought someone besides me should finally know. Lily smiled against her husband's shoulder and said nothing at all, because some things, she had learned, over a wolf and a bathtub and 3 years of small ordinary happiness, didn't need saying twice. The fireflies rose over Silver Brook, gold in the dark, exactly where they belonged.